Okay, lovely. Well, thank you for inviting me. And in particular, because I find that pastoralism in the Middle East is hardly ever covered. And I think there are a number of reasons for that. Uh, Pastoralism in the Middle East doesn't fit very well with what I'm going to call the colonial or neo-colonial discourses for a number of reasons. But I'm going to start by trying to give an overview of pastoralism in the Middle East. But when I say pastoralism, pastoral societies, because as a social anthropologist, I'm always looking at people, their relationship with central authority, their relationship with nature and the environment in general, and so on. And there are just a couple of comments I'm going to make at the beginning, but I'd love you to bring them up later on because these are now emerging as really important issues. First of all, pastoral society in the Middle East, they are seen as autochthonous. They are not seen as indigenous. So there isn't the kind of notion that these were people who were here before any other people came, with the exception of Israel and Israeli settler colonialism. So that's one thing I want to look at. I also want to look a little bit at the contested meanings of the term Bedouin, because this is the term that's generally applied to pastoral herding societies in the Middle East. Sometimes, if not Bedouin, they'll use the term Arab, which is the same as the term for people who speak the Arabic language. But Bedouin has a different derivation and is really important in a kind of historiography of dichotomous groupings. I'll say a little bit about that, and then I'll move on to what Ian actually asked me to do, which is to discuss some of the significant difficulties and factors that have emerged over land use over time, as well as current adaptations to pastoral tribal society in Arabia over the last 3 decades. So my comments and my reflections, as Ian said, has gone back for a very long time. I began with my PhD work. I was going to say 40 years ago, but I think it's more than 40 years ago, in the early 1970s. So I did start my PhD very young, but still not young enough that I can hide or mask that I am emeritus now. So my original fieldwork was with the sheep herders in Syria, Lebanon, and then, of course, some of those groups moved into Jordan between 1972 and 1975. I then went back for another period between 1977 and 1979 to Syria specifically to do a lot of follow-up work. At that time, the Syrian government had no interest in Bedouin or in tribes, so they were quite happy to allow me to have a Fulbright. And I even used to take the military aircraft to Palmyra to work with some of the Bedouin tribes in that region, not knowing that the castle up there was a notorious prison. I then spent 15 years in Oman working with mainly camel herders and goat pastoralists, and then returned back to Lebanon, Syria between 2005 2010 as a kind of follow-up, which was really lovely because I came across a lot of the families that I knew from 30 years before, saw the young women I had seen get married now as grandmothers. And so my work in both areas has been sometimes broken up by other areas of, I'm going to say interest, but some of the interest I hadn't expected. When I came to Oxford in 1996 to work on my first monograph on Omani pastoralists, which I called mobile pastoralists, because they were really using vehicles for everything, I bumped into a woman named Barbara Harrell Bond, which I think, Robert, you know. And she came up to me and she said, "I've got a post I want you to apply for." I said, "Really?" She said, "Yes, it's in refugee studies, it's in forced migration studies." And I very flippantly said, "Oh, I don't do forced migration, I do forced settlement of nomads." And she said, "Well, it's all the same thing. It's all about social discrimination. It's all about statelessness. It's all about impoverization." And she went on, and well, she was right. So I've been working with both people who are being forced to settle and people who are being forced to move. Now, there we go. I've just put this map up, which really shows only the areas that I've worked in, and it's not as though there are no Bedouin here. It's just that I haven't worked with the big Nejdi tribes. Are the origins of the tribes that moved up into northern Arabia. But these are the true groups that I've worked with, mainly the Sanad Fadan Sba in the northern Badia, and then the Harasis in the southern region. I've tried to keep up with other changes. A lot of what I describe in Oman is typical of what's happening in this region, and what happens in the north is also quite typical of the northern region. So what I want to just say is, as background, the kind of historical contextualization is that all of these tribes, I'll start with the tribes in the north. Where is that arrow gone? I don't really see it, but anyway, there it is. Well, it keeps. I'll use my finger. I'm close enough. The tribes of northern Arabia basically controlled the region that was called the Mamura, which was an area where you could dry farm. And they established a system of collecting tribute from agricultural settlements. And throughout the 18th, 19th centuries, those tribes that were closer to settlements who didn't want to have to pay tribute to the big camel herding tribes coming in from the north turned to the central authority of the Ottomans and registered with the Ottoman cities. So the Bedouin have always been part of the registers of Ottoman governance. The sheep herding tribes paying their tribute to the Ottoman government, and the Nejdi Bedouin tribes, the noble tribes who were in those days only camel herders, collecting money when they could, but also threatening central authority that if they weren't given sizable annual purses of gold, they would disrupt trade. So these tribes basically controlled the movement, particularly during the pilgrimage. The Ottoman authorities had to pay these tribes in order to guarantee that the pilgrims would make it to Mecca, but traders from Basra, Baghdad, and Mosul, when they wanted to get their goods to the Mediterranean, they also had to engage with the Bedouin tribal leadership, the larger tribes, in order to guarantee they could have safe passage across the desert. And I should say, it's not really a desert. Northern Badia, it's semi-arid land. You'll see a few images later on. So these tribes had really strong relations with central authority in terms of their leadership, and it was the leadership that was constantly working, negotiating, settling conflicts, and so on. And most of the tribal leadership had very lovely homes in places like Mosul, in Aleppo, in Damascus. Amman didn't exist at that time, but in a place called Salt, which was the old ancient Ottoman capital in Jordan. Their children were often very well educated. They often spoke Turkish. A few of them spoke French. And this is something that Gertrude Bell comments on when she moves through the region and is documented. And if any of you have followed some of the more romantic stories of Lady Jane Digby, you know that she met her Bedouin sheikh, not in the desert, but she met him in Damascus because he had a big house in Damascus. So what I'm trying to say is this relationship with the urban context goes back for quite a long time. And the big confederation of tribes, the Anaza and the Shamar, the Anaza mainly moving through the area that we think of today as Iraq, but the Anaza moving in this area and very closely connected with the Saudi, the House of Saud. And even today, there's a lot of intermarriage, creating political ties, and these various tribes decide on granting of refuge or supporting members of their tribe, and even salaries, whether it's through some sort of national militia, what have you. This, what I'm going to call the tribal leadership in northern Arabia, was rediscovered by David Petraeus, as you know, in The Great Awakening, because he had to use these tribal leaders in order to develop the kind of background that he needed in order to control the uprising. And then between 2011 and 2015, again, one of the most important of the tribal leaders, again, Shammar rather than Anaza, was the president of the Syrian National Council and doing a lot of negotiations in Gaziantep for about 4 years. It looked as though there was going to be some success, but that didn't work. So I think in the north, it was very clear that land use by tribes was constantly being negotiated and renegotiated by this tribal leadership, but these tribes were marginal in the way that Ernest Gellner used the term way back in the 1960s. He talked about tribes of the Middle East being marginal rather than a term that was acceptable in those days, being primitive. And what he meant by their being marginal was that they existed on the margin of central authority and they could withdraw from central authority whenever it suited them and then re-engage when it suited them again. So This kind of marginality was very clear at the end of World War One, or actually, I should say, during World War One. A lot of these Bedouin tribes fought with Emir Faisal and Lawrence in order to keep the French out of what was then Greater Syria. Having failed in doing that, they went through a period in the 1920s when they were fighting amongst themselves, and the French decided to impose a pacification program. Why? Not because they necessarily wanted to spend that money, but the kind of fighting that was taking place was threatening the oil lines, basically the Haifa line, H4 and H5. So most of the fighting, again, that was taking place through here was disturbing oil, which was, even at that time, extremely important. And one of the many things that they did, which was, I think, devastating for your, I'm going to say, your kind of middle-class, average Bedouin family, was in order to tempt these leaders to work with the mandate authorities, they began to give them private ownership of tribal land, upon which they could settle their people in villages in this area that I called Mamora, where you could have dry farming. So there was massive registration of what was tribal land in the name of individual tribal leaders, these families. They also offered them seats in parliament, which continues even today, and that carried on through the 1950s. By the 1960s, there was an effort at land reform. There was a cutting back on what they thought was too much power amongst these tribes. Actually, some of these rules still exist today. Up through that period, tribes people in the desert or in the semi-arid lands were allowed to carry pistols. They were meant to leave them in the semi-arid land before they went to cities, but they often didn't. So they were often a sort of a rule of their own. And the different states, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, began passing legislation to limit the power of the Bedouin. Jordan was the least successful of all. I think in Syria they made some significant efforts in that direction. But what also happened during this time, if you think of the 1960s and 1970s, a period when development aid was becoming very, very big, the UN was beginning to be very active in the region, particularly the World Health Organization, the Food and Agriculture Organization, we began to see this discussion of these groups not as being equal partners, but as being backward, as being irrational, as having to be settled in order to be modernized. And there's some very interesting work by Ricardo Bocco. In fact, his PhD thesis is looking at just this kind of phenomena in Jordan, where international aid projects were all being sort of put forward as only being successful if these people could be settled. So you had a huge number of settlement projects put into effect, and then borrowing from East Africa, this idea of setting up ranching systems in Saudi Arabia, in Jordan, in Syria, and so on, which, as you know, they basically failed. But the outcome was that the herders in general were becoming increasingly impoverished as more and more of their land was being taken over for agriculture or was being declared private property. In some places, the herders were being squeezed into smaller and smaller areas, and then the discourse of land degradation became very popular. That still continues today, although I've seen very few reports based on empirical data to support these claims, but I'll go back over that. When you get to the 1990s, right after the Brundtland Commission report of 1987, and first it was 10%, but then it was an effort to make 15% of the Earth's surface protected. It was often, in the Middle East in particular, at the expense of these herders and herding societies and what I'm going to call other local stewards of the environment. So pastoralists in Arabia then, if they hadn't lost the land to farming, they started losing the land in the name of conservation. And I'll show you some of these images in a minute. Syria in particular in 1992 signed up to all this as a way to make Syria appear to be a very modern progressive state. It also had large tracts of land that were nature reserves, particularly to reintroduce the Arabian oryx, which had not been seen in the region for over 100 years. So it was a reintroduction of an animal that had been extinct for a very long time. By the early 21st century, some things began to change. We first began to see it in northern Arabia, and that was the kind of celebration of Bedouin heritage, Bedouinism, for ecotourism. Donald Cole and Thoraya Turkey from AUC, American University in Cairo, first started reporting about this in Egypt. Then we began seeing it in Jordan and in Syria. And now, of course, it's also in the Gulf states, where a lot of Bedouin customs have been taken over by the state, and they're being reworked and revived So you've heard of camel racing. Camel racing has become a very big commercial activity, hunting with falcons or sparrowhawks, and even golden eagles. There's a lot of exchange now with Mongolia, where the golden eagles are brought in to be used instead. And with all these activities, there's often a very large purse or numerous purses involved. I'll say a little bit about that. But what I have found really interesting, and you can ask Roy whether he thinks that or not. He always says that I always find the positive side of what can be really a very depressing picture. In many cases, there was a kind of benign neglect of what was really happening on the ground. And what I've seen happen both in the north and I'll show you in the south of the Rub al Khali, is that many of these Bedouin tribes rejected being settled, but they began to maintain or develop multi-resource economies. So part of the household would start working. They would go into wage labor, often with the police, with the army, with intelligence, or in some sort of transport system, still maintaining their herds. In the northern Badia, these herds were still important. They were more than just subsistence herds. These were basically awasi, fat-tailed sheep that are very important, particularly after Ramadan. And in the south, the herds became mainly subsistence for milk and for racing because of the potential for suddenly increasing your income. I mean, it was a lot better than putting your money down on the euro, whatever, the weekly lottery. Sorry. So I pointed the wrong direction. Got it. Okay. So now let me go back, and I've got one back. I've got one too far. Okay. So let me just look at this northern Badia. So the tribal community. I worked with 2 tribal communities, and both of them moved from the area of inside from Homs down into the Bekaa Valley. So the Bekaa Valley has always been considered the finger of this semi-arid land of the Badia. It's kind of Homs, Selmiya, and into Lebanon, the Hermel, Al-Qara. And it's been referred to as early as the 12th century in Arabic historiography. So it was always an important grazing area, and it was also a kind of secluded area where the tribes could be sure to find graze, particularly along the anti-Lebanon mountains here. But with the French mandate, of course, this area, the French decided to open up for private investment starting in the 1930s, 1940s, 1950s. So more and more of that land in the Bekaa then began to be farmed with individual ownership. And for a lot of the herds, they lost access to that kind of open grazing. But the land along the anti-Lebanon mountains wasn't really that fertile. You couldn't actually farm it. So that remained an important grazing area up until, I would say, into the 1990s. Even, or maybe because of, and throughout the Lebanese Civil War of 1975 to 1990, a lot of Bedouin who had moved into the kind of the slaughterhouse engagement in Beirut and other activities sort of returned more to full-time herding as a way of sort of managing life during the Civil War. And they also began negotiating with farmers to bring their animals in after the crop had been cut, and also to feed on the sugar beet residue. Sugar beet factories became very important in that region. So this is the 1970s. This is the anti-Lebanon mountains, very typical tent. Some of you know this structure. That's the front of the tent. We're actually at the back, but it was a very hot day, so a lot of the sidings had been brought down. Men sitting up here. The tents normally have 2, sometimes 3 sections, but already in the 1970s, what began to happen is they began to build 2-room cement structures in different places where they knew that they would graze their animals. So you can see one cement structure just in the background here. I've been back to see them, and they have a few more cement structures, but basically they're adapting, modifying, but still trying to maintain some kind of mobility. At that time, in these cement structures in particular, you had these really important tribal gatherings where inter and intra tribal disputes were negotiated and arbitrated, generally around the coffee mangal. So this was a very typical scene where perhaps 10, 15 years earlier it would have been within a tent, but this was kind of the modernizing Bedouin of Lebanon. I must just say, just as a kind of aside, the Bedouin of Lebanon are very, very sensitive to being recognized for modernizing and being progressive. And Bedouin in general in Lebanon reject the term Bedou and only accept the term Ashair or Ashairi. So they are ready to be called tribal, but not to be called Bedouin. And I should have, perhaps at the very beginning, said that the word Bedouin derives from Bedu, which means people who live in the desert. So they've kind of rejected that term for rather being called tribal. Syria, when I went back, again, you've got these same kind of very long tent-like structures. When it gets too hot, the flaps are opened up. But in Syria, the Bedouin began buying tractors in the 1980s. And the tractors were so that they could rent out the tractors to farmers as a way of creating subsidiary income. And of course, they always had some kind of a mobile unit in order to try and move as they needed to from one camp to another. So this kind of adaptation was quite interesting. Their engagement with agriculture, they didn't farm, but they had the equipment that farmers needed, and many farmers in the 80s couldn't afford having their own tractors, so they hired from the Bedouin. At that time, somewhere around the 1970s, many of the Bedouin families had decided to move to truck transport. Often you just had to sell about 3 camels in order to be able to buy a Nissan half-ton truck or a Toyota truck. But many of them couldn't afford the Mercedes trucks, which would mean selling a lot more camels. So in the 1980s, generally the Sheikhly families owned the big Mercedes trucks, which they would then lend out to the different families as they needed to move their household from one place to another. And they often hired helpers. These 2 guys at the top aren't Bedouin, but they've come to help load up the whole household and move them on. Another decade later, and sorry, go back here. No, I've got to go this way. Yeah. Right. So by the 1990s, when I started going back on regular visits, I began to see now that more and more of the Bedouin had the larger trucks, and they started using hired shepherds. So hired shepherds from weaker tribes or families that had become impoverished. They would hire men to help them herd their animals, often around 300 or 400 sheep at any one time. Some of these young men would try not to be hired locally. So the poorer Syrian shepherds would go to Jordan to work with Jordanian wealthier households, and poor Jordanian would come to Syria in order to be hired. So they would put some distance between themselves and their social group until they could save up enough money to reinvest in their own herds. So these are the kind of trucks that you almost find now with every family. And with these trucks, actually, it almost came out of a necessity to respond to what the government was doing. It meant that the Bedouin with sheep could move deeper and deeper into the Badia with their sheep, as their access to the Mamura and to areas that were being monopolized by state projects became off limits, because by the end of the 1990s, the state began setting up companies in collaboration with Saudi Arabian companies or with Iranian companies to herd sheep on an industrial scale, meaning 2,000 to 3,000 sheep at any one time. It was like locusts moving throughout the desert. So there was some real degradation taking place, but this was through the massive state projects rather than the herds of what I'm going to call the more middle class kind of families. So I put this image in for our female doctoral students, because increasingly, and certainly in Arabia, when you see images of Bedouin, you only see men. So the women have disappeared. They've disappeared from dancings at weddings. They disappeared from events where important issues are being discussed. They're still there, but their images are being kind of blocked out. This is this was a tribal gathering between Palmyra and Deir ez-Zor. Actually, it's an area that I was watching with quite some horror because ISIS held this area for a very long time. But I'm just hoping everybody kind of fled and moved out of the area. So by the time we get to the 21st century, in this part of northern Arabia, you've got basically conflicts over the rights to water wells, still being left to traditional arbitration. The state has recognized that it really can't manage these desert areas. It doesn't have enough police or armed forces to come in. So water well arbitration is very much left to be negotiated between the tribal leaders. But there is now a greater restriction on grazing areas as more of the semi-arid land is being declared as protected areas for nature. And one of the biggest areas it's really unfortunate is a place called Talila, which is just out of Palmyra in the direction of Deir ez-Zor, where the state has taken over an area that's about 25 miles by 75 miles. And they've dug a trench that you can see by satellite that's 6 foot deep to keep camels out, but in order to reserve it for oryx and gazelle and not much else. This is Talila before the camel herders were forced to take their animals out. And along this area as well is one of the main oil pipelines that the Bedouin are restricted from moving close to, because these are now well patrolled. There's also the armed conflict. First, the civil war, or I should say the invasion of Iraq, and then the civil war in Syria, has meant that some of the grazing areas have been destroyed because of the fighting, but a lot of the herds are moved across international borders to other related tribal members or sub-tribal groups in order to protect the capital of extended families and sub-tribal groups. And there's a lot of this exchange taking place between the Shammar of Iraq and the Aneza of Syria and Jordan. So a lot of this movement is going back and forth. What I think particularly amusing, I was talking with some of the technicians in the Ministry of Agriculture in Damascus in 2007, 2008, and they were telling me about this amazing rise in the rate of twinning of sheep amongst Syrian herds. And I said, really? Yeah, nearly every ewe is giving birth to twins, because the numbers had jumped up so much. They hadn't recognized that what was happening is that the Iraqi kin were bringing their herds over in order to protect them from the fighting in Iraq. And so the numbers of sheep were jumping to such an extent in Syria that they thought it had to do more with a sudden change in the fertility of their animals. That's the north. So let me just get this up. Now I want to just talk about the Harasis, which is this area that I'll talk about in detail, but a lot of what I say relates to the Bedouin in this region. So this is really a desert. When I first got to Oman after being in the Syrian Badia, I looked back on Syria and thought of it as a meadow. I mean, when you first look at that landscape, it feels so barren. It just looks like rock and gravel. And I always wondered, what do they mean when they say grazing land? Where's the grass? That just simply wasn't there. Now, unfortunately, in Oman, when the current Sultan took over in 1970 from his father, Had a lot of confidence in his British advisors, and one of the first things that the British did was issue a white paper to the Sultan, Sultan Qaboos, to recommend that all land in Oman that wasn't privately owned should be declared and should become state land. So it becomes the land of the Sultan. This created very, very significant problems in Dhofar, which has been written about, but I won't go into that right now, because there were a number of tribes that competed over very sparse resources, and it became, in a way, a free-for-all. This region also, the IUCN got very involved in conservation and was really keen on reintroducing the Arabian oryx. And they selected an area, kind of this northwestern quadrangle of the Harasis, as most suitable. But then at a certain point, they also withdrew UNESCO withdrew its badge of good work, so to speak, and declared that the region was overgrazed, but again, without any kind of study. But it's this kind of idea that these people who live in the desert don't really know how to take care of the desert because they don't use scientific methods, and their own knowledge, well, is backward or it's irrational. So in this area, I'm going to say that the two big places of conflict are state-led, and it relates to the notion of who has the right to use the land, but also, and through that, the big issues are about the environment and the restrictions to access of particular areas in order, to reintroduce the oryx, and number two, restrictions that are put into place by the oil company in its effort to locate oil to keep the Omani economy going for longer and longer. And although originally there was very little oil exploration in this area, over time it's become one of the more important areas because technology has now advanced to such an extent that they can get that oil out of the ground. But what's happened is with there are areas of grazing, important grazing, that end up looking like spaghetti junctions because the pipelines are just everywhere. And at certain times, it was possible to get the general managers of these oil companies to bury the pipelines every few miles so that the herders could move their vehicles and their animals. But it was often just a goodwill gesture that only lasted for the duration of that person's tenure as general manager. So that's just a bit of a close-up of the area that I want to talk about. This is the Jidda al-Harasis. It's about 40,000 square kilometers, about the size of Scotland. And up until the late 1950s, there was no water, absolutely no water on this plain. The herders, during the summer, when temperatures would reach about 50 centigrade, sometimes 55, would generally go down to the escarpment where there were a couple of springs in order to see out that really difficult area. This quadrangle became the area that the government allowed the IUCN to set up as a nature reserve for the oryx, excluding the Harasis from using it. And this area became very important for the oil company for their exploration. A lot of the Harasis looks like this. These are some of the fingers of the empty quarter sand dunes, the kind of reddy orange sand dunes that feed in to the area. But what keeps this region habitable, is I think it's called occult precipitation, like the Namibian desert. There are two times of the year, generally around March and October, when there's a very heavy mist and a dew that comes over the land, particularly that northwestern quadrangle, and allows for 2 seasons and some significant growth, mainly of the acacia bushes and acacia trees in the region. And during these times of the year, families in the past used to throw blankets over the trees and then squeeze out the liquid. But they always prided themselves on not ever needing to drink water. They just drank the milk of their animals. Anyway, so I'm not quite sure how the IUCN recognized that that quadrangle was, the, if I could call it the most fertile, the most resources. I think partially because there's so many acacia trees in that particular region. So they set up the Oryx project in 1982, and by 1996 they started with 48, but by 1996 they had about 400 roaming in this area with the Harassis Bedouin. Some of them hired to track the animals, but others told you can't bring your families or your livestock anywhere nearby. By 1998, the numbers, 400, was so large that a live capture project, you could almost call it, by rival tribesmen who were very angry that the Harassis had been hired as trackers and that they hadn't, but also there were significant prizes being offered by wealthy Saudi and Emirati, sometimes 100,000 pounds for capture of a live female oryx and so on. So the numbers dropped to 120 with only about 40 females. And the government called in the army, brought all the oryx back into a smaller enclosure of about 5 miles by 5 miles. It's still patrolled and guarded by the army. And this is when UNESCO decided they would remove this sanctuary from their lists on the basis of overgrazing. So again, this kind of overgrazing comment is still regarded as an indicator of how these people don't know how to look after their environment. I'll just take you through some of the earlier pictures. My first image, my first trip through the desert, I came across a group of women getting ready for a wedding. It was the first time I'd ever seen a full face mask, because as you know, well, in the images of Northern Arabia, women cover their hair, but they don't cover their face. These were some of the earlier images when they still kind of moved through the desert by camel, and sometimes had long journeys of 6-7 days in order to get water from the 3 wells that were opened by the oil company by the late 1950s. This particular group is one of 6 tribes in Syria who speak what's called modern South Arabian. This is a Himyaritic language that predates Arabic and now fortunately is being protected by UNESCO in their Endangered Languages program. And interestingly enough, when I first started working with this group, they never called themselves Bedou. They called themselves Arab. Now, of course, that term has begun to be used more and more, and they will respond to that name. They were also called the Tree People by the early British explorers who came through the region throughout the early part of the first half of the 20th century, because they didn't have any shelter, they didn't have any sheep, so they really couldn't weave, and they would make some blankets or buy blankets from Bulgaria and elsewhere through trade that they would throw over the trees in order to provide shade. So shade and shelter was home. But by the end of the 20th century, they began to purchase tarpaulin from the Emirates, and also the government began to build cement housing in some of the centers that they opened up for these people. It took about 25 years before any of these cement houses were actually used by people. Initially, they just put their animals in there. But as schools started to open and other kind of activities were developing at these centers, they began to use them. But in a way, I'm going to say a kind of resistance to this. I won't call it forced settlement, but it was activities that kind of resulted in their adopting these cement housing. They also began to develop what they called the azab or the azba, which when you look it up in the dictionary, it says farm. But for them, it's kind of what I'm going to call like a weekend retreat, or it's really the mobile camel unit began to be seen as the kind of weekend retreat, or the place where families gather on weekends or on long holidays. So the temporary camel camp has now become extremely important. it was very common for almost all of these families to have at least one concrete villa or townhouse somewhere near where there are a set of schools, mosques, coal stores, petrol stations, and so on. A number of these kind of centers have been built by the governments of Oman and also by the United Arab Emirates. And to maintain what they say is their heritage and their culture, their focus is now on these temporary camel camps, which are where they keep their camels, and sometimes quite a large number of them. They're being fed. This is, you can't really make it out. But it's a little bit like, I suppose, going back to the family farm in the old days, if you still had connections with the rural countryside. But these camel camps are considered very important in terms of maintaining their culture and teaching their children the important activities related to being a Bedouin or an Arab, whatever. So the camel milking, the young men, because the girls aren't meant to milk camels, are always asked to do this when they come on the weekends. And going off on a drive to look for bustard or sandbirds, I forget the very common. You can see the rifle, probably a 19th century rifle, front-loading of some sort. Extremely important activity, and this always happens around the mobile camel camps, where it's kind of, I'm not going to say it's an exaggeration of the significance of the culture, but you really feel that the Arabic is spoken very little at these camel camps. It's mainly Harsusi, this modern South Arabian language. The young are set about doing a lot of chores with camel herding, or they're off with their fathers and grandfathers conducting some kind of activity in the desert. But there's an awful lot of innovation, and this is where sometimes I say benign neglect sometimes leads to very positive adaptation. As I said, these camel camps are managed basically by, you can almost say, an army of Baluchi and Indian herders. So they hire Baluchi and Indian herders to come and stay with their animals, while often the young men have jobs with the army or the police, and they need to know that their animals are well looked after. They've also, so this particular Baluchi Rasul, he's been with the same family for 25 years, and I'm always amazed. He goes home every 2 years. The last time I went out there, he brought his son out as well. So they live quite an isolated existence, but obviously it's not so bad that they don't renew their contracts every 2 years and come back again. They also, in these camel camps, is where you actually see the use of modern technology in a way that I haven't seen in the peri-urban settlements. So these mobile camps were the first to start using solar panels in order to run generators to refrigerate the camel milk and also to have lights at night. And they began to have to refrigerate the camel milk because some of the young coming back from school on weekends and so on wanted to drink the camel's milk. And if you didn't refrigerate it, you'd have to throw it away really quite early. What also emerges from within these mobile camel camps is the preparation of camels for the numerous camel races and the numerous beauty contests that have begun to emerge in the regions that are sponsored by the state as a way of maintaining the authenticity of this group, giving them other ways of creating an income. And so you've got these camel races, you've got beauty contests, and the purses for these events can be, again, from as little as £10,000 equivalent to as much as £50,000, or in terms of camel racing, sometimes £200,000. You can walk away with a brand new Lexus four-wheel drive if you're a camel. Sorry, this is a special camel feed for camels being prepared for racing. Let's move on. So, yeah, let me see if I can get this both up. I don't know how many of you are familiar with camels. Well, camels in Mongolia don't look like this, that's for sure. But if you've been around camels, then you'll know that this camel has been shaved, except for the tuft of hair at the very top. I took a group of Omani and some expatriates with me to the first beauty contest that was held in Oman about 3 years ago. And we all sort of wrote down what we thought were the characteristics of the most beautiful camel. And none of us got it right 100%. Some of us got a few things, but all of us thought that the eyes would have it. Great big camel eyes and whatever. Had nothing to do with it. It was all about the way that the hump sits and the tuft of hair on top of the hump. Of course, the drape of the neck. But the most important element in terms of camel beauty was the way the lower lip falls, or doesn't fall. Anyway, this camel has just won, and the owner has walked away with a Lexus 4x4. He wasn't particularly happy because he was hoping to have a little bit more than that. But these are elements of what I call cultural revival that are actually encouraged by the state. There's a way that there's kind of income that sort of travels around the different groups and helps to keep people involved in the desert, even if it's only in terms of subsistence. And of course, now what's also emerging, but that's almost come out of European demand, which is a kind of neo-colonial Orientalist image that many of these countries, this is in Oman, but you find the same thing in the United Arab Emirates, have begun to have to advertise camels and camel trekking, camel caravans and so on. And a lot of this has come out of Western demand. So you're beginning to see this also on a lot of posters of their brochures. That's a very young boy. They're all kind of showing how well they can balance and dance on top of the camel. So what I'm seeing is over 40, well, actually longer, if you look at the historical element, is the way that there is now really an increased mobility of individuals, which is one of the reasons why I've really moved to using the term mobile pastoralists rather than pastoral nomads or anything of that sort, but a decrease in actual household movements, with a lot more movement of these temporary camel camps in the south. Also an increase in the use of split households. You've got the multi-resource economies. You've got some households, some element where the authenticity of your belonging is maintained. You've got this hiring of shepherds, not of camel herders from Baluchistan, Sindh, and now in northern Arabia, they come from Egypt. But the greatest problems that I think all of these pastoral societies face today is, one, climate change, because they are getting extreme weather conditions. I mean, right now, a lot of them are quite happy about it because they're getting sudden violent rain in the desert with deep flooding. So if they're in the wrong place, they lose their vehicles, they lose their animals if they can't move out of the wadi fast enough. But then they've got a wonderful grazing about 6 to 7 weeks later on. But they recognize the temperatures are getting a little bit hotter. A lot of them now have started to import generators with air conditioners so that in the summer months they can sit in these portable cabins for a few hours. The extractive industry, still very, very problematic. There's this tendency of the extractive industry to regard pastoralists as kind of parvenus, people who just show up because they're there. And then, of course, conservation, which I spent a little bit more time talking about, this prioritizing of reintroducing animals that have been extinct for 50 to 100 years over considering the needs of those still using these semi-arid lands, these deserts. So I think the continuing challenge really is, one, somehow to tackle the pejorative attitudes to a lot of the herding societies, mobility in the region, also their animal herding, and to stop looking at the peri-urban seasonal settlements as a signifier that pastoralism has died. This is then say if they start taking up seasonal residence in some of the villas that are being offered to them on the edges of towns, it's kind of like, oh, well, they're not Bedouin anymore, they're not herders anymore. And there's this lack of recognition that how much they have adapted in order to keep their herds and to keep their animals. And then secondly, this tendency to regard the land that they occupy, because they don't leave any trace often behind, as terra nullius. Most of the engineers, particularly the Western engineers with the oil companies, regard the deserts as terra nullius. They're really only interested in what's under the ground. They're not interested in what's on the ground. And as far as they're concerned, these people have no particular rights that they need to account for in their activity, which is quite similar to the position of a lot of the conservationists in the region as well. There. I'm done. So hopefully you've got some questions.